And we're going to work with circuits with independent voltage sources first.
The voltage drop across a 6
The problem is to write the mesh equations for the circuit that we have shown below.
I1, which
This is our first example of mesh analysis, so we're going to go through a few
clockwise
points of interest and
6K
important
resistor.
steps
And we
in
also have
performing mesh
I3,
analysis
which is
and
flowing
coming
the
up with the
opposite
mesh
direction.
equations.
So the
First thing
current
we want to
through
note
6K
is that
is
mesh
gonna be
analysis is the
I1
same thing as loop
minus
analysis.
I3.
The terms are used interchangeably. In this problem, we can
across the
identify
6 kilo
several
resistor.
meshes. We have a mesh
As
on
we
the
continue
left-hand
around
side
that
of the
loop, we
circuit,
encounter the 6-volt
which
source,
is the
positive
left loop,
polarity
if you
first.
will. We
So
also
we
have a mesh
have
on the right-hand
6
side, which
volts
is
to
the
this,
right mesh or right
that
loop
gives
of the
us
circuit. We also have a
first
mesh
mesh
which is
equation
around the
for the loop
outside
equation.
of the circuit.
Upon inspection, we see that
And so
it
we
has
have
two
three different
unknowns,
meshes.
as I1 and
They're not
I3
independent of one another
associated with it.
because the outside mesh composes
In the end,
the,
we want three equations, right?
left
Because
and
we
the
have
right
three unknowns,
meshes.
I1,
So
I2, and
we're going to
I3.
write mesh
Let's look
equations
at
for
loop
two different
2.
meshes, mesh
Loop
1
2
and
is the
mesh
lower
2 for
left-hand
this
loop,
problem.
starting in the
So
lower
first
left-hand corner,
of all, we're going to
traveling up
identify
through
the
9
meshes.
kilo resistor.
This is our mesh 1.
have
This is the mesh
A
current
voltage drop of 9K
associated with mesh 1. And this is
times
mesh
I2.
2, the right-hand side mesh. And we're going to assign currents for mesh 2
Continuing around this
to
loop,
I sub 2.
we have
So we have
voltage
two
drop
meshes,
across-
I1,
associated
or
with our
mesh 1
6-volt
and mesh
source,
2,
which is
and mesh
negative
currents
polarity
I1 and
first.
I2.
So it's going to be minus 6 volts.
So the first step in writing the mesh equations
Continuing
is
around
to
this
use the
loop, we
passive
encounter
sign
the 3
convention
kilo
to
resistor
assign
in the center
polarities across the
leg of the
different
circuit.
elements. Our voltage sources
voltage
already have
drop
polarities
is gonna
assigned,
be
so we don't have to do that.
3K.
But we have to identify polarities
And then
for
I1
the
is
resistors
flowing
and the voltage drop
into
across the resistors.
the 3K.
So
and
using the
positive
passive
polarity
sign
of the
convention,
3K
if we start
resistor,
with the
so it's
leftmost
gonna be
loop,
I2
and we're looking at the current I1, it flows through
minus
R1. And
I3,
passive sign
which is
convention
flowing
tells
into the
us that
negative
the
polarity.
positive current flows into the positive polarity of the voltage drop across a
that's equal to 0.
resistor. So this would be
So that's our
identified
second
like this,
independent equation. And
as
upon inspection, it
VR1.
has two unknowns as well, I2 and
to
I3.
VR1. We also have,
Now
we
our third
continue around that
equation
loop,
for the
past
right-hand side
resistor
of
1,
this
we have
circuit.
resistor 3,
So the
so we have a
right-hand
voltage drop
lower loop
across it,
has 3
VR3.
voltage drops.
And if we continue around that
Has,
mesh, we have
first of
R2
all,
at the
starting
bottom
both
of
lower
that
left-hand
loop,
corner, voltage
and the
drop
voltage
across
drop
the
again
3
using
kilo
the passive
resistor,
sign
then
convention
the 6,
is
and then the 12 volt
VR2
on the right-hand side of the
across
circuit.
the voltage
So
or the
starting
resistor at the
with
bottom of the
3K
left-hand
voltage
loop.
drop, we see that we're in the
Okay.
negative polarity.
So now we're going
that
to turn to the
voltage drop.
right-hand loop and we're going to
So it's
assign polarities
minus
for it. So if we look
3K
at that, and starting at the lower
I2
left-hand side of that loop and
minus
going around
I1.
the loop, we already have a polarity assigned for R3, so we don't need to do that.
Now going up
We
to
have
the 6
our
kilo
voltage drop at the
resistor,
crop
negative
top,
polarity first
VS2
of that
has a
voltage
polarity
drop,
already
it was
assigned. And then we come around to the right-hand side of the
6K
circuit, we have the resistor R4.
I1 minus
Using the
I3,
passive sign convention, we know that the
was that voltage
positive
drop.
direction of the
We
current
see that from equation 1.
meets the positive polarity
And then we
of the
have
voltage
the
drop
voltage
across
drop associated
R4
with the 12K
first. So we
resistor,
assign
And it's going to be
that voltage drop
12K
VR4 as shown. And then we go
times
around that loop,
3,
continue around the loop to R5, same
and that's
technique.
equal to 0.
We have a voltage drop
So we have these 3
VR5
equations and 3
across
unknowns.
resistor 5.
So
So
we
that's
would
what
solve
our
these equations for I1,
polarities
I2, and
and
I3,
our voltage drop assignments.
and then we could find any
are
other
based on the
value that we
passive sign
want
convention.
for voltages.
The next thing
or
we're going to do
currents
is we're going to add
of the
up
circuit, as well as
the
power.
voltages around each loop to come up with the mesh
A
equation.
point of interest,
Because we know
is
that we're going to use
these
Kirchhoff's
equations,
voltage
while
law
we wrote them
as a
in this
way of
fashion,
solving
it's perhaps
these problems
easier to
in
think
mesh
of
analysis.
these voltage drops.
And
in a
Kirchhoff's
little bit
voltage law
different
tells
way.
us that the
So if we
sum
look at
of the
this
voltage
drop
around
in
any
equation
closed
3,
loop
it's minus
is equal to
3K
0 at any
I2
instant in
minus
time.
I1.
So whether we take loop 1, loop 2, or if we
It should
even
be, first of
choose
all, it should
the
be
outside loop around the
minus
outside of the
3K
circuit,
I2
if we add up
minus
those
I3.
voltage drops, the sum of them is going to be 0
So that should be
at
a
any
3
instant in
instead of a 2
time.
in that first
So let's
term.
do that. Let's start with,
That's the voltage
mesh
drop across
1,
this element.
and
It's
let's
this
add up the
voltage drop
voltages
here.
around that loop.
And this
Starting
voltage
with the
drop
lower
we assigned
left-hand
to
corner
plus
of
or
that
minus,
mesh,
and
traveling
if you
upward
look
in
at
a
the second
clockwise
equation,
direction,
here it is,
the first
right
thing
here.
we come across is
We're just
voltage source
rewriting it
VS1.
in the
And
third
we,
equation
in fact,
because we
hit the negative polarity of that voltage source first. So we
introduce
have
and
minus
see the negative polarity of the
VS1
3K resistor
for our first voltage drop.
first.
We continue around that
So we
circuit,
have this
and we
expression.
encounter resistor R1
It's interesting
with
to
the
know
voltage
that
drop
if we write that
VR1,
minus 3K
encountering the positive polarity of it first.
I2
We have
minus
plus
I3.
VR1. And we have,
That's equal
continuing
to
around that circuit,
3K
the voltage drop across R3. So we have a
I3
plus
minus
VR3. And we continue around
So
that
we could
loop,
just as
and we
easily
encounter resistor
have-
R2 and the
when we're
drop
summing up
across
the
it,
loops around this
and that's
last
VR2. We get the
loop,
positive polarity
summing
of
around the voltages
each
around
one of the
this last
resistor
loop, starting at the lower
voltage
left-hand corner,
drops.
we could have said first.
So they're
The voltage
positive
drop here is
quantities.
3K.
And so that's our first
I3, which is
KVL
flowing
equation.
this
That's our
direction,
first mesh
positive direction
equation
through 3K,
for loop 1.
minus I2. That's what we have.
We also
down
have
here.
loop 2.
It's exactly the same expression.
Again,
as
doing the
what
same
we
thing with
had
loop 2,
before,
starting at the
using
lower
our
left-hand
sine
corner of loop
voltage
2,
drops.
traveling clockwise
So
around
sometimes,
the loop.
and many times, it's easier.
The first thing
to
we encounter as we
write
start that
these
journey is we encounter the
mesh
voltage drop
equations or loop
across
equations,
resistor R3.
thinking of
We get
each
the
loop
negative
current as being
polarity
a
first,
positive,
so it's minus
and
VR3.
the associated current with the loops that are joining that loop that we're adding up.
We
the
then continue
voltage drops
and we
across as a
encounter
negative
the
current.
voltage source
That's what we've
VS2,
done
the
here,
positive
3K,
polarity first,
I3, which
so
is
it's
positive
plus
in loop 3,
VS2
minus I2, which is flowing the opposite direction of
is the
the
3.
positive I3 current.
Continuing around that loop,
Estamos aquí, amigos míos, en el Medio Oriente, una de las regiones del planeta que cuenta de las historias más antiguas de la humanidad. Específicamente, estamos en Marruecos, al este de la capital del país, en una pequeña ciudad llamada Fez. En esta pequeña ciudad vamos a encontrar diferentes trazos muy importantes de la historia. Vamos a encontrar lugares medievales. Vamos a encontrar el refugio de los judíos luego de la expulsión de Europa por los reyes católicos. Vamos a encontrar rastros de las invasiones de Portugal, España y Francia en este país, la relación que tienen los árabes con los europeos, las similitudes culturales que existen entre los hispanohablantes y la gente de Marruecos, todo en un mismo punto geográfico específico, un puntico pequeño pero con una carga histórica atómica importantísima. Por eso he venido hasta aquí, para que hagamos juntos un recorrido en lo que se conoce como la joya escondida del Medio Oriente. Bienvenidos a Marruecos, bienvenidos a
wherever we
Fez.
have a resistor to replace the voltage, for instance, VR1, we can replace that by equal to I1.
Miren qué
times
interesante, estamos entrando aquí en el
R1.
cementerio de los judíos, un cementerio que
We know
data
that
de la era
voltage drop
medieval, más o menos en el
VR2,
1400, cuando los reyes de la Iglesia Católica expulsaron a los
VR2
judíos de
is equal
Europa.
to
A los judíos les tocó
the
por
same
fuerza
current,
encontrar
I1,
diferentes caminos en diferentes lugares. Encontraron aquí en
times
Marruecos este refugio, y aquí
R2.
tenemos la cicatriz de aquella época, este cementerio, el cual
Let's
hoy en
skip
día en la
R3
actualidad lo
for a
siguen
minute and
utilizando.
move on to
Cuando
R4
Adolfo
and
Hitler
R5.
estaba aniquilando a
We
todos
know
los
that
judíos a lo
for
largo y ancho de
resistor
Europa, él vino
R4
aquí a
from
hablar
the
con uno de
voltage
los
drop
duros
across
del
it,
reino de Marruecos
gonna be
para decirle
I2
que le entregara a todos los judíos.
times
Este señor,
R4.
el rey de Marruecos en la época,
And
le dijo, no señor,
similarly
aquí
for
no me vine a
R5,
fregarle la vida a los
voltage drop is
judíos,
gonna be
porque
I2
nosotros, la gente de Marruecos y los
R5.
judíos, somos hermanos y somos como
Now
si
let's look at
fuéramos uno solo.
R3.
Desde
again.
ese entonces, la gente de
R3
Marruecos y los
has
judíos
a
han tenido
current
una
I1 flowing
hermandad
through it,
así de
and it
cercana.
also has a
Cuando
current
Israel
I2
fue reconocido
flowing
como
through it,
un
but they're
país,
flowing in opposite
muchísimos de los judíos a
So if
todo
you
lo largo del
remember,
planeta
using the
se fueron
passive
por
sign
su propia
convention,
cuenta
we
a Israel y
assigned
allá se
the positive
radicaron. De los que se quedaron aquí,
across
que fueron muy
R3,
pocos,
the voltage
sigue habiendo
drop
algunas
across R3
familias.
to be at the
Cuando un
top
miembro de sus
of
familias
R3
muere,
based on
lo siguen enterrando aquí en los
the positive
cementerios
current
judíos.
I1
Hay
flowing
tumbas de la
into
era
the
medieval, hay
top
tumbas
of
mucho más
R3.
recientes. Miren qué
Okay.
especiales
So
son
we
las
have that
tumbas,
current
¿no?
flowing
Todas
in,
tienen como esta forma
and we
de
also have
óvalo,
the current
esta forma
I2,
así
which is
como
flowing the
mirando para
opposite
arriba,
direction
y
through
tienen
R3.
aquí grabado en
So
hebreo
the voltage drop
los datos de la
VR3
persona con la fecha y toda la cosa. Hay
VR3
otras tumbas que ya son más
is gonna be equal to
rectangulares y cuadradas.
I1
Esta, por ejemplo, es del año
minus
39,
I2
plena Segunda Guerra Mundial. Seguramente
times
alguien que vino aquí escapando con su
R3.
familia de Adolfo Hitler. Y la gran mayoría
And we
es como si
chose
fuera una
I1
pequeña
as the
ciudad, ¿no?
positive
Una pequeña
current
ciudad
because
con
using the
casitas
passive sign
ovaladas blancas
convention,
como lo vemos aquí.
that was our
Aquí
positive
descansa
current
la
flowing into
señorita
that voltage drop
Solika
across R3.
Achuela,
The I2 is
que
the
fue
opposite direction,
asesinada a
so
los
it has
17
the
años.
negative
Ella era una
sign
niña
in
de
front of it.
17 años,
So now we
judía,
have R1,
que se
R2,
enamoró
R3,
de un
R4, and
musulmán.
R5
En esta
identified.
tierra siempre han
We
estado
see
los dos
that
juntos conviviendo. Pero entonces la familia no
plug
aceptaba que
those
ella no
into
quería
equation
unirse al
1 and
judaísmo
equation
por
2,
seguirle los pasos a su
then we'd have
enamorado.
two
La familia en una
unknowns.
medida desesperada
Our only
intentó
unknowns would
casarla
be
con una
I1
persona muy
and I2.
importante del judaísmo de
So
la
we'd
época.
have
Y ella al
two
negarse,
equations
los mismos
which are
judíos con la
independent of each
familia de
other.
acuerdo
we'd
decidieron
have two
decapitarla
unknowns,
para
I1
mostrarle a los
and
otros
I2.
jóvenes judíos
We could solve
que
for
con la
I1
religión no
and
se
I2
juega.
for new values for the resistors and for the voltage sources. And if we solve for I1 and I2, then we have everything else that
Hola,
we would need
pequeño.
for the circuit. We could solve
Wow,
for the
este
power
que se ve que tiene una vida
absorbed, the
dura,
power
parece.
supplied. we could solve for the voltage drops across any element in the
Bien
circuit.
acabado.
So
Aquí estamos,
that's all we need
ya
in
en
order
las
to be able to
entrañas del
solve for
barrio
all the
judío,
values of interest
al
for
lado del
this
cementerio.
circuit.
Esos barrios